Welcome to the Rochester, New Hampshire History Podcast, a monthly show that will shine a light on a piece of history that has been all but forgotten.
One of Rochester's oldest and historical cemeteries is known locally as the Old Rochester Cemetery, to differentiate it from the Old Rochester Cemetery. This cemetery is located off South Main Street. Access to the cemetery is by an unmarked right-of-way behind the U-Haul building at the intersection of South Main and Franklin Street. The cemetery is unknown to many. It is downtown, but off the beaten path. A tour of the cemetery will reveal well-known early Rochester families, such as the Hansons, McDuffees, and Farringtons.
The origins of this cemetery begins with the Commons. In the early days of Rochester, the Commons was used as a burial ground. Unfortunately, the ground at the Commons was so wet that the graves would fill with water. The bodies were removed from the Commons and moved to what is now known as the Old Cemetery, which was laid out in the early 1800s.
On Father's Day weekend, we visited this old cemetery and was saddened and disappointed by the overall condition of it. The fence surrounding the cemetery is mangled and ruined. Cans and trash were scattered upon the ground. The grass was not cut, and in some places the grass was knee-high. Branches were strewn on the ground. Gravestones were toppled. Some are laying on the ground with dirt and pine needles covering them. The cemetery is in a sad state and not welcoming to visitors. Even though the cemetery was in bad shape, we conducted a tour of this hollowed ground.
As with most old cemeteries in New England, many of the older stones were sunk into the ground, hiding the identities of who was buried. Also, some of the older stones had fallen prey to the weather, and their names have disappeared. There are old stones that are leaning and not upright. One of Rochester's most famous doctors is buried here. Dr. James Farrington was born in Conway in 1791. After graduating from medical school, he moved to Rochester in 1818 and set up his practice. He was one of the first doctors in Rochester. He was also a banker, a politician who served in the United States House of Representatives, New Hampshire Senate, and the New Hampshire House of Representatives. In 1834, Farrington and his brother-in-law, John McDuffee, organized the Rochester Bank. Farrington served as the president of the bank until 1859. In the 1830s, this bank was a frontier bank. No other banks existed between Rochester and Canada. Dr. Farrington married Mary D. Hanson in 1827. They had 4 children: James Bonaparte, Mary, Joseph, and Walter. Dr. Farrington passed away on October 29, 1859.
One of Rochester's greatest benefactors was Dominicus Hanson, and he is buried here. Dominicus Hanson was a wealthy businessman who died in 1907 at the age of 93. According to Dominicus's wishes, his son Charles deeded the Dominicus Hanson Park to the city after Dominicus's death, popularly called Hanson Pines. It is protected by deed to remain without buildings or roads. Rochester's Hanson Street was built through the family's land in 1849. It remained a private street, which the Hansons kept in good shape. Hanson had the street paved in 1901 at his own expense with over 50,000 granite blocks.
During the Civil War, metal coins became scarce due to the hoarding of coins by citizens, which created a need for a paper version of small change. To make up for the lack of coins, some businessmen would print scrip or paper money, which could be used in place of government money. Dominicus issued his own scrip in many denominations: 10 cents, 25 cents, 50 cents, which read as follows: State of New Hampshire, Rochester, September 27, 1862. For value received, I promise to pay on demand in current bank bills in sums of $1 and upwards at my place of business. Dominicus Hanson. Dominicus's paper money circulated throughout all of New England. It was never refused, and it was always redeemed.
Heroes of the Civil War are also resting here. David Austin. He joined the Navy in May 1861 and served on the following Navy ships: the Wanderer, Colorado, and Hope. Austin survived the war and returned home to Rochester. George Guppy. He was wounded in April 1865 and taken prisoner by Confederate forces in Virginia. George survived the war and returned home to Rochester. Not all who went off to the Civil War returned home. In particular is the gravestone of Joseph Trickey. Joseph was born in 1820 and joined the Army in 1861. He was part of the 5th New Hampshire Regiment. The 5th New Hampshire Regiment was one of the toughest regiments in the Union Army. It had the unfortunate distinction of having sustained the greatest total loss in battles of any Union regiment, with a total of 200 295 killed and 756 wounded. Joseph was wounded at the Battle of Gettysburg and died of his wounds on July 2, 1863. He was married and had one child.
In the 1860s, a new cemetery was needed as space was limited in the old cemetery. Franklin McDuffee and Ebenezer Wallace bought the land adjoining the old cemetery for a new cemetery. On September 9, 1864, they sold it to the Rochester Cemetery Association for $750, the same amount that they had paid for it. This ends the podcast. Don't let the condition of the cemetery dissuade you for visiting this small piece of Rochester history. If you have any questions or comments, please email bobgriffinpodcast@gmail.com. Come back next month for another episode of Rochester, New Hampshire History.